Disasters happen, and they can be catastrophic, affecting large populations and geographic areas. For example, in California, we have wildfires, storms, mudslides, floods, earthquakes, power outages, extreme heat, and cold. Natural disasters destroy homes, property, infrastructure, and lives. Some disasters are caused by humans, like mass shootings or a terrorist attack. Other incidents are noted also on the slide. Emergencies are smaller events. Emergencies happen every day to some family, business, or individuals. Examples are home fires, medical emergencies like a heart attack or a stroke, drug overdoses, and traumas that occur, for example, in a car accident or after a bad fall. First responders arrive at the scene. They then triage, meaning they decide whether to transfer someone to the emergency department in a hospital or perhaps a more appropriate facility like a mental health center or social service clinic. In the field of disaster and emergency management, a prevailing theme is you can't predict, but you can prepare. This video focuses on communication and the kinds of issues that arise when effective communication between first responders and people impacted by a disaster or an emergency fail. Before we go any further, however, let's first consider what we mean by communication. The key phrase here is the joint establishment of meaning. Successful communication is a two-way process in which messages are negotiated until they are understood by both parties. Although speech is typically the fastest and most reliable way to share information face-to-face, it is certainly not the only way. We all use many other methods. Let's now consider issues that could interfere with effective communication during interactions that occur between first responders and individuals impacted by a disaster or an emergency. People can face converging communication challenges during a disaster or emergency. In fact, the disaster or emergency itself is a challenge, often defined by chaos, fear, and confusion. Communication disabilities affect more than 46 million people in the United States, and they can make effective communication very difficult. Also, approximately 47 million people do not speak or understand English very well, so communication with first responders may be limited. In addition, limited health literacy causes problems. Health literacy refers to the fact that many individuals in the United States, in fact almost 90 million, do not really understand how their local health care system works. Finally, an unspecified number of people have cultural, sexual, or religious beliefs or differences in lifestyles that may not be familiar to first responders, and these differences sometimes negatively impact communication. So let's do the math. Many people are at high risk during a disaster or an emergency. In fact, you probably are someone or know someone that faces challenges when communicating under certain circumstances and may have difficulty interacting with first responders. Pam's story is a great example of lessons learned. The setting is North Dakota in April of 1997 when a dike was breached and the town flooded. "The sirens woke me," she said. "I was terrified because no one was there to get me up." In fact, she was stuck in bed until 10 the next morning when her personal assistant came by boat with the National Guard. They barely had time to get her in her wheelchair, grab her medications, her computer, and Jessie, her golden retriever service dog. Pam noted that the rescue team knew about her, even though they had never met, and that her personal assistant had been able to tell them that she couldn't speak, but she could write, she could indicate yes and no, and had some signs and gestures, and that she also used text-to-speech software on a computer to communicate. Pam became very concerned, however, when the soldiers told her she couldn't be evacuated to the same shelter as her family and friends because of her disabilities. The soldiers had set up a makeshift shelter at the local elementary school in the special education classroom. The soldier said, "Well, I know it's crammed, but you and your service dog, Jessie, will share this space with a man in a wheelchair who cannot speak, read, or write. You'll have to take turns sleeping on the cot." However, as it turned out, Pam was never able to transfer to the cot, so she spent days and nights in her chair. They gave her a pen and some paper she could write with, but she wasn't allowed to use her computer because they needed to conserve electricity. One night, when Mayor Pat stopped by, she recognized Pam. Before she left, she told the soldiers, "You know what? Pam needs to be able to use her computer, at least at night. Let's make that happen." One of the things Pam did at night was to make herself some communication boards. One had the alphabet and a few words. The other contained phrases and some words specific to the situation. But Pam didn't stop there. She also made a board for her roommate. Because he was not literate, she used graphic symbols. Together, they identified things he wanted to say, like soldier, help, stink, and afraid. And she helped him learn how to use the communication board. After the events, Pam spent years creating more tools and doing presentations so that she could use her story to raise awareness and promote preparedness. So let's review Pam's converging communication challenges. She faced two major issues, one related to her disabilities and the second to her situation. She had lived independently, relied on support from people, from tools and technologies to meet her daily needs. The flood threatened her safety, her access to tools, and her support network. It also threatened her independence and, in fact, her health. However, if Pam had not been able to communicate, she would not and could not have managed nearly as well as she did. Let's meet another person. Maria was from Mexico and spoke only Spanish. She lived in a small apartment with her husband and 4 children. One afternoon, Maria had a significant pain in her abdomen and asked a neighbor to drop her at the emergency room. The hospital staff immediately called for a Spanish-language interpreter. The nurse also grabbed a communication display to help identify the location of her pain and its severity. When the interpreter arrived, he had difficulty understanding Maria's speech because she had a severe stutter. He asked her to write and provided her with a pen and paper. She immediately started to gesture, obviously upset. The interpreter surmised and then confirmed with Maria that she was anxious about her children. They needed to be picked up from school, so she was begging the staff to call her husband and take care of them. Maria had converging communication issues. She had limited health literacy, limited English language proficiency, and a speech impairment. She was able to read and write in Spanish, but to a very limited extent. It took a combination of approaches to meet Maria's immediate needs and provide appropriate treatment. Serve of the Monterey Peninsula, a nonprofit organization, conducted interviews with 6 first responders a few years ago. The goal was to identify the wide range of communication issues they faced every day on the job. Participants in the interviews included firefighters, an EMT, and an emergency operations coordinator. Since the time we spoke with them, some have retired and others have been promoted. We asked 5 questions. How important is effective communication in your job? What communication issues do you typically face? What kind of information do you need from the people who are impacted? What training have you had in supporting effective communication? And what strategies do you depend on? And which of these strategies do you feel is helpful and what other ones might be helpful? In response to the question, how important is effective communication in your job? All said communication is critical and that solving communication challenges is paramount. The consensus was our job is all about communication. Captain Reed noted that during an emergency or a disaster, people are often not at their best, so we need to quickly solve any problems that exist. Captain Hagler said communication is key. You've got to be able to communicate with your patient. Chief Dempsey told us that at least 70% of their calls every day are medical emergencies. Captain Black also said that in a medical emergency, we need to bring calmness to chaos and gather information. Captain Sullins noting that communication with family members is also very important because they often want to help. As the emergency operations coordinator, David Potter said communication is a huge part of his job, and it includes communicating with the community. He added that in Monterey County, that means communicating with many people who have limited English proficiency. In fact, they all agreed that the number one issue they face as first responders are language barriers. Captain Hagler, who had worked in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana, noted that their EMTs used to use the language line all the time. Chief Dempsey also told us that when he had worked in Chicago, many languages were spoken, so they too used the language line. These first responders use multiple strategies. Several that we spoke with had the ability to speak some Spanish, and most of them carried cards or what they called cheat sheets with Spanish phrases. They all noted that they rely on family members, especially children, who often speak English very well. Luckily, we also have local resources in the Monterey area, specifically the Defense Language Institute. They also face communication challenges. When someone has a disability that affects their communication or their current condition, for example, if they've had a stroke, if their condition makes it difficult for them to talk, first responders do their very best to establish effective communication. They noted that it is important they not misjudge the cause of a communication problem. For example, slurred speech does not necessarily mean someone is drunk. In response to the question, what was your most challenging communication experience, Captain Hagler recounted the time her team responded to a 911 call. They found a woman who had lost a significant amount of blood. The woman was deaf, blind, and had no speech, so they had no way of communicating with her. Her son was there, but he was also visually and hearing impaired. So we asked, well, what did you do? Captain Hagler replied, well, we worked it out. They wrote questions. The son used a magnifier to read the questions, and he also acted as an interpreter for his mother. As a result, the EMTs were able to transfer the woman, together with her son and the magnifier, to the hospital. The next question we asked was, what information do first responders need to get from a patient? They agreed. They needed basic information and information about what caused the problem and what the problem is. They also need information about the person's pain level and whether their condition is improving or deteriorating. Once they identify the problem, they can prioritize solutions and triage effectively. It was interesting to learn about the multiple strategies these first responders used. They make every effort to show respect and to be sensitive to the patient and their family while rapidly assessing the situation. They made it clear that part of their job is being mindful of their own behavior and how it might affect others. They all agreed. We try to remain calm and professional. One said, we learned to be like a duck. When we asked, what do you mean? He said, well, we may look real calm above the surface, but down below the water, we also may be pedaling like crazy. The truth is, we may be as anxious or even more anxious than the individuals we're trying to help. Their response to the question, what communication tools do you regularly use, reflected the kinds of information they needed. They asked if the person can write, use gestures, respond to yes and no questions, and some use a pain scale. They also noted that they had to be careful about how they used gestures. They tried not to startle anybody, and before they touched someone, they asked permission. During the interview, we talked further about the types of communication tools available and asked for their feedback. We talked about yes-no questions, pain scales, communication displays, and communication apps. They reminded us that tools can make a huge difference, but before they do, you're going to need to know how to use them. For example, Captain Reed and Chief Dempsey said, you really need to know how to ask yes-no questions, and do this with caution. You need to establish clear signals before you begin asking questions. For example, you would begin by saying, show me how you say yes, and then show me how you say no. You need to confirm with the person, okay, you'll tell me yes like this, and no like this. Also, sometimes you need to help the person tell you, I don't know, or something else, and so you would develop a third signal. Then you can begin asking questions. For example, you might say, are you in pain? Pausing for a response. Then you would ask your second question, do you feel sick? Again, pausing. You don't ask, are you in pain or feeling sick as one question. Making sure you give the person time to respond, and while they're responding, you're watching closely. Then you can ask other questions, like, can someone help you communicate, and so on. The first responders we interviewed liked scales, especially those with graphics. Captain Reed reminded us again that the location and intensity of pain can change and that this is really important information that first responders need. These first responders also liked the variety of communication displays we showed them. Many of these are now available online and can be downloaded easily in multiple languages. Today, apps are increasingly used during disasters and emergencies, as is social media. As shown here, some apps are designed for specific populations, and others are designed to support people in specific locations, like a shelter or under specific conditions. The final question we asked was whether communication issues and strategies were addressed as part of their training as first responders. They said they didn't really get much training in communication and had to learn on the job. They noted that the training they did get had a curriculum that was often statewide and mandated. All agreed that training is essential and that it should address communication issues. In one way or another, they said learning on the job is not always the best idea. They also agreed that emergency exercises for responders should really include people who have communication challenges so they could help first responders learn better ways of coping with these barriers. One example of a useful tool, Tips for First Responders, can be downloaded, laminated, then carried in a fire truck or an ambulance. Each page gives some tips for first responders to deal with individuals who have a very wide variety of disabilities or conditions. These interviews help us understand how important effective communication is to first responders during a disaster or an emergency. It enables them to do their job and save lives. We know that disasters are unpredictable and that emergencies happen every day. You can't predict, but you can prepare. Are you prepared? We want to thank these amazing 6 people and first responders everywhere for their service to our communities. We also want to thank the many people we know who face communication challenges and who have shared their stories over the years. For more information, please see the list of resources here and go to the website www.cerv501c3.org.